Thank you, Liam, and good morning, everybody. Good. As we said last week, we've been particularly looking forward to this series because it is, if you like, it goes right to the heart of who we are as a church. What does it mean to have faith conversations? In fact, last week I said that there are three priorities that we want to shape our life around as a church. Number one, we exist for the benefit of those who are not yet part of us. Or to put it another way, that we hope that this will not simply be a good church that good people come to when they move to London, but rather that this would be the sort of church where many people from all sorts of backgrounds, which mean they would never, ever dream of coming to church, would find themselves in due course. And we talk about that sometimes amongst ourselves as what it means to be engaged with others. Second priority we've said is that we want to use our passions and our gifts to make the world around us a better place. We think everything matters to God. After all, He created it. And consequently, we think it should matter to us. And our own shorthand for that, based from Psalm 24 and verse 1, is that the Psalm is, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So we talk about that as an everything church. We want to be engaged with everything. And the third part is that we want to do it all. Whether we're having faith conversations, whether we're renewing the city, whatever it is, that we want to do it all, relying on the presence of the Spirit. We talk about that sometimes amongst ourselves as being empowered. And it won't surprise you, I guess, today, given that it is Pentecost Sunday, the Sunday when the church remembers the giving of the Spirit to us, that we wanted to talk about particularly two of these three things, but maybe you combine it all. We wanted to talk about how the Holy Spirit helps us in terms of having faith conversations. Now, I should say, too, that a lot of what I've got to say this morning builds on what I said last Sunday. So if you weren't here last Sunday, I would really encourage you, particularly if at any point you think, hang on, he's missed out a couple of steps here, go back, listen to last week's podcast, or we now even have them on vodcast. You can see them on YouTube in video form as well. If you'd rather see my face than just listen to my voice, you are now able to do that. Lucky you. So that is all there. And please do, more seriously, do have a listen if you didn't listen. We felt that was a particularly important material that we covered last week. There is a challenge. Actually, there's a huge challenge in combining faith conversations, the renewal of our cities, and doing it all in the power of the Spirit. Let me try and explain the challenge to you like this. In emerging world nations, the church has managed to combine faith conversations and the presence of the Spirit to great effect. It's resulted in the church serving the spiritual needs of hundreds of thousands of men and women, as well as making a lasting contribution to the society around them. Great stuff. However, I think it would be fair to say that the church in the Western world has not been so successful in this regard. Given the fact we're in the UK, let's talk about the UK, where, of course, due to education, which is a thoroughly good thing, rationalism and often a reliance on science has meant that there is greater skepticism when it comes to spiritual things. Therefore, where churches in the UK have combined a desire to have faith conversations and the presence of the Spirit, they've not been anything like as effective as in emerging world nations in the effect that they've had. And it seems to me, therefore, that we have some questions to ask. I'm not suggesting that churches like ours, churches that typically are known as charismatic, that have enjoyed the presence of the Spirit, have not grown over the last 20 years. They have. But many of them, with a few notable exceptions, many of them have done so simply by attracting Christians from other situations. And of course, that doesn't leave any nation with any lasting contribution from those who would regard themselves as followers of Christ. So today I want to do this. I want to search the scriptures again. And I want to ask, how can we combine faith conversations, renewing our city, and the presence of the Spirit in such a way that it might, in our generation, have a lasting effect on the people and the society around us? And we've entitled this talk, More Than Words. And I want to go to an Old Testament passage from the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel was a remarkable and very unusual prophet who had some extraordinary visions. If you want to know more about that, you'll have to read the book. We haven't got time to look at the whole thing now. But I want to look at this morning one particular vision that he had, which essentially encapsulates this idea of combining faith conversations, renewing the city, and the power or the presence of the Spirit. So I wonder whether we can read it together. It's Ezekiel 47, and we're reading the first 12 verses. So Ezekiel is having a vision here, and he says this: "The man brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple towards the east, for the temple faced east. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, south of the altar. He then brought me out from the north gate and led me round to the outside of the outer gate facing east, and the water was flowing from the south side. As the man went eastwards with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was ankle deep. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through water that was knee deep. Another 1,000 and led me through water that was up to the waist. He measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. And he asked me, 'Son of man, do you see this?' Then he led me back to the bank of the river. And when I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on each side of the river. He said to me, 'This water flows from the eastern region, goes down into the Arabah where it enters the sea. And when it empties into the sea, the water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There'll be large numbers of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand along the shore from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim. There'll be places for the spreading of nets. And the fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But the swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They'll be left for salt. Fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river, and their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail, and every month they will bear, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. And the fruit will serve for food, and the leaves for healing." What do we see here, or what did Ezekiel see? First of all, he sees a temple. In the Old Testament, the temple was the place where God dwelt. In the New Testament, the temple was the place where God dwelt. But there was one significant difference between the two temples. In the Old Testament, the temple was bricks and mortars. In the New Testament, the temple was people like you and me. Paul talks about men and women built together into a place where God could dwell by his Spirit. So as we read this from our vantage point, the other side of the cross, we understand that temple to be people bound together in the way that only God can as he joins us. And then we see water coming out from under the temple. Well, water is often a symbol for the Holy Spirit. So clearly in this temple, the Spirit is not just amongst the people, but it's going out. And what strikes us as we see it going out is the sheer scope and volume of the water. As we read it, Ezekiel says, "A man took him 1,000 cubits, and then the water was ankle deep. Then another 1,000, water was up to the knees, another to the waist, and then it got to the point where it was just too deep for anyone to stand in, and evidently was flowing so strongly, Ezekiel says you couldn't cross it." My calculations are that the width of that river from one side to the other was approximately 3 miles wide. We are not talking here about a little trickle, but this vast flow of the Spirit that comes out from people experiencing the Spirit. But the effect of the river is even more important than the volume of water involved. Ezekiel says that when the river pours into the sea, the salt water becomes fresh. In fact, everywhere this river goes, what was lifeless gets turned into life. And it's not just a little bit of life. Ezekiel says wherever the river flows, there are swarms of living creatures. Swarms, I take it, means lots and lots and lots of life. Not only that, but along the banks are trees. And we're told their fruit is for the feeding of the hungry, and that the leaves are for the healing of the hurting. We're also told that wherever the river goes, things turn into life. In other words, there's nowhere that's impervious to its effects. Moreover, it's not a seasonal thing. We're told that these fruit trees that now line the banks are always in season. It is never winter or autumn, think of it. It is always spring or summer. So you've got this wonderful picture of what the effects of the Spirit are meant to be like as they flow out from amongst the church into wider society. There's one other element that Ezekiel mentions. He says that there are fishermen standing along the banks of the water throwing their nets in. Does talk of fishermen and catching fish remind you of anything Jesus said? Remember what he said to the disciples when he first met them? He would have been thinking of this passage. He said, I will make you fishers. And they would think back to this passage of, not fish, but of men. In other words, the idea is that as the Spirit flows out from the church, it starts to work not just in the structures and the communities of society, but it also starts to draw on men and women's hearts. Men and women start to find themselves starting to ask questions about the big issues of life, about God and suffering and peace and wise living. And they find themselves drawn towards the answers as a result. This is the picture that Ezekiel is writing out, drawing out for us. And of course, it is one that we are somewhat familiar with as a church. We've often said that the church down the ages has been responsible for things like starting schools, making music, advancing scientific discovery. We've often said that it's been the church historically that has fed the hungry, housed those without shelter, cared for those in prison, and helped many find faith. And that, of course, is something of our mission here in this city. So this morning what I want to do is I want to trace the process of the Spirit from in the temple out into broader society and see what we can learn, see if there's some distinct steps, and be able to place ourselves along a continuum and ask, what is next? What are the next steps for us? What might the Spirit on this Pentecost Sunday be saying to us? So where does the Spirit start? Well, I think there's a step even before a gathering like this, the church together with the Spirit dwelling, and that is he starts in our hearts. He starts in our individual hearts. We heard something of that from some of what was shared by different individuals this morning. We've often said that the Christian faith is not primarily a set of propositions, nor is becoming a Christian agreeing to a set of statements. You can be far from being a follower of God, but agree with everything that Jesus said. What's the difference? The difference is a relationship. Those that follow Christ, that are Christians, are those with a relationship with God. And that relationship, of course, is created, is given to us by the Holy Spirit. And I want to suggest that this is where we start. This was just going to be a sort of brief introductory mention, and I was going to go on to other things. But after all that we heard about new music and new life, I just want to hold there for a minute. How are you doing with the flow and the life of the Spirit in your own heart at the moment? Is your faith more of a love affair or something rather more cold and stale? Don Miller puts it like this, reminding us of the importance of relationship. He says, propositions do not satiate the deep longings of the soul. But the presence of God is what you and I have actually been created for. When he made us in the garden, he made us with a longing and a yearning for God's presence. That's why sometimes when we worship and we feel his presence, it's like there's a leap in our hearts. Because you and I were made for that. Not just made for a relationship with one another, though that is important, but we're made for a relationship with him. Don Miller goes on, he says that Christianity, of course, is a love story. And he says without this, it becomes old and cold and dead and stale. It becomes formulaic and propositional and non-mysterious and scientific and of no power. But when we understand that it is a relationship geared around a man who has come, who was God and died, then we find that the story of the cross is not just pure facts, but as someone else once put it, it's a fountain to drink from, it's a flame to burn with, and it is love to bathe in. That is the invitation that we have in terms of a relationship with God. And that is where we start. You cannot hope to have faith conversations unless first there is faith that is alive in your heart. Anything less than that will simply not work. So that is where we start. It starts with the work of God in our hearts. And maybe this Pentecost Sunday, for some, they would say, I've had that work of God in my heart before, but I need it to come back into life. And there'll be an opportunity for us to pray before we're done. So number one, starts in our hearts. Then, of course, it gathers momentum, if you like, as we gather together to worship. And the church gathered, experiencing the Spirit, should be a powerhouse of the Christian life, as we express our love and our gratitude and refocus our lives on everything that's important. Not only that, but we experience His presence amongst us. And there are times as we do that where people are literally healed physically, just as we sing, where they sense God's presence, or where we're simply overwhelmed by His love. One of, I think, the best things about working for this church full-time is that I get to worship twice on a Sunday, not just once. So we come into His presence and just enjoy Him together. One thing to bear in mind, which is important, though, when it comes to faith conversations, which Paul, as he writes about our worship together and our life in the Spirit, which is so crucial and foundational, one thing that Paul says is that we're not to do anything as we worship that would cause our visitors to think we are, well, the term that he uses, out of our minds in 1 Corinthians 14. Not got time to look at it, go through it in detail, but I want to just draw our attention to it briefly. In the context of the passage where Paul is writing, he's particularly talking about lots of people speaking in languages, inspired languages, God-given languages, and nobody interpreting them. He says that will make people think life is very strange around here. But I think the principle that he's trying to make is a broader one, which is this: be aware of your visitors as you worship. Now, what that means in practice, of course, will vary from culture to culture, because every culture around the world has very different standards of acceptance in terms of emotional expression and other things. But maybe the best way of thinking of this is for you to imagine bringing with you a close friend who is exploring faith at present, and them joining you at church and thinking about how you would want others to conduct themselves at that time. Maybe this illustration would help. If you have guests over for supper, then you arrange things so that they will feel at home with you. You may even say to your children, if they are at the younger end of things, no, we're not going to do this, or we're not going to do that. That is inappropriate when we have guests. Paul is simply saying the same. He is saying, consider others. Now, interestingly, as he says this, he doesn't seem to think that being aware of others should reduce the level of power or intensity of the Spirit's presence. A couple of verses later, he says that if we will conduct ourselves maturely and share the things that we feel God is saying, that people are likely to be overwhelmed amongst us. And some to even respond by saying, surely God is amongst you. So I'm not suggesting by this that we try and calm things down. I, for one, am really happy and love the way that we worship. I long as much as anyone for more of God's presence as we go forward. But at the same time, what we should bear in mind always is that we're aware of and considerate of others along the way. Life in the temple. Individually, streams of living water flowing within us. Corporately, a powerhouse of life, but aware of and considerate of others at the same time. Step 3. Then the Spirit often starts to equip us and prepare us for life outside the temple. 4. In the New Testament, the Spirit is always taking us out of the temple. He never leaves us in. Even when you read in the New Testament of times where the church gathered, almost always they gather to be sent out. Even, well, if you think about Pentecost itself, they gather to pray, the Spirit comes on them, and what do? They're out in the streets. 2 chapters later in Acts 4, having been persecuted and imprisoned, they gather together, they pray, and they are shaken, and then they go out proclaiming the word of the Lord broadly. Next meeting probably is Acts chapter 13, where prophets and teachers are gathered together to pray, and the Spirit speaks and says to Paul and Barnabas, go. So the Spirit is always pushing us out. And often when we're gathered together, we will find that the Lord will impress on our hearts people who He's calling us to serve. You see it in Isaiah, in chapter 6, a wonderful chapter. He's in church, he's in the temple. He has this extraordinary encounter with God, and God asks him this question, who will go? And Isaiah ends up saying, doesn't seem to be anybody else God's talking to. Does God ever do that to you? He said, I'll go. Who was he going to? He was going to people like himself. God will often call us and equip us to go to people who are similar to ourselves. Sometimes they're people where you live. Sometimes they're the people who you live life alongside in your workplace. Other times they may be those who share the same season of life as you. But do not be surprised when you come to worship if you find the Spirit urging you out, typically to people you are like. On other occasions, the Spirit will urge you to go to people and serve people who are very different from you. It's in Acts chapter, end of chapter 10 or early in chapter 11, that Peter goes up onto a roof to pray. It's one of my favorite stories about prayer simply because he then falls asleep, which just makes me feel better for the occasions where that has happened. Peter goes up to pray, he falls asleep, and then he has a vision in which the Spirit is prompting him to go and serve the last people in the world he thought he would ever go and serve, the Gentiles, the unholy, the impure, as a religious Jew would see it. And so Peter went with remarkable occurrences as a result of that. Now, to be honest, the most important thing is not, is he taking us to people like ourselves? Is he taking us to people different from ourselves? But what is the Spirit saying to you? Where is your particular contribution in this city? If this is something that you're particularly wrestling with, and I know a number of you, because I've had conversations with a number of you, where you've said, I just can't work this one out. Second part of our Introduction to Christchurch London course, June the 2nd, between the services, that's all we're going to talk about. How do you identify your contribution? So join us, sign up online, join us if you think that that would help you. We'll have a more in-depth conversation on this then. But as we come to worship, the Spirit pushes us out and takes us to different groups of people. And we find that we don't just go as individuals, but we go, if you like, as teams. And we're finding that's happening increasingly amongst us. Tim and Jackie Frisbee are now leading a group in South Central London. They would say our vision is to love our neighbours and our neighbourhoods. So these are people who feel the Spirit's prompting them to their locality. Barry and Ange Catlett in North London. Their vision is to make North London a better place by sharing life, showing love, and seeing people discipled in faith. Lots of others that I could mention. A small group of musicians starting to pray about, are we to gather together to serve in the music industry, seek to make that a better place? What is the Spirit saying to you? What is the Spirit saying to you about where He would take you? So the Spirit equips us and he gives us gifts. We've not got time to talk about that at length. But just to say, you've got natural gifts that God created you with. The Spirit often comes on us and heightens those. If you're naturally a leader, it's quite likely that you're meant to lead in this flow of the Spirit, but you do so with an extra added sharpness, brightness, life, because the Spirit is upon you. If you're created to administrate, if you're created to show mercy, if you're created to be creative, particularly, then do those things, but do those things with the Spirit upon you as well. And then the Spirit sends us out. And as the Spirit sends us out, our job is to watch where the Spirit is going. You notice with this river, Ezekiel can't make it flow somewhere. It's a bit like King Canute standing in front of the tide and saying, "Stop, tide." Any of us who've dug sandcastles on a British beach know what that's like.